Today, we're going to dive into the incredible story of how a country in southern Africa completely transformed from being the colony of Rhodesia into the nation we know today as Zimbabwe. It's a journey packed with conflict, tough negotiations, and ultimately the birth of a brand new identity. So, at its very heart, this is a story about change. It's all about how names, flags, and even whole systems of government can shift over time, shaped by struggle, by conversation, and by this powerful desire for a different future. To really get it, let's think of our story in three main parts. We're going to start way back with some powerful ancient kingdoms. Then we'll jump into the era of British colonial rule, when the country was called Rhodesia. And finally, we'll see the dramatic birth of the modern, independent nation of Zimbabwe. Now, this is really important to understand. This land had a rich, powerful history long before any colony was ever established.
For centuries, you had these really sophisticated African kingdoms, like the one that built the amazing city of Great Zimbabwe. And we're not talking about simple villages here. No, these were powerful states that built incredible stone cities, managed huge trade networks for things like gold and ivory, and developed a really rich culture.
Everything started to change in the late 1800s. It was a time called the Scramble for Africa, when European powers were all looking for new territories. So the British South Africa Company, led by a very ambitious guy named Cecil Rhodes, showed up, drawn by all the mineral wealth. Through a series of deals and takeovers, they gained control, and the area was eventually named Southern Rhodesia in his honor. And what came next was a system of colonial rule. So, what does that mean? Well, it meant that a small white minority held pretty much all the political and economic power. They controlled the best farmland and all the valuable resources, which created a society that was super unequal for the majority Black African population. So as the decades went by, other African nations were gaining their independence. But Rhodesia's white minority government, they chose a very different path, a path that would pretty much make them an outcast on the world stage. In 1965, the government, which was led by the white minority, got worried about a shift to majority rule. So they made this really bold, really defiant move. They just declared themselves independent from Britain. Now, this wasn't about freedom for everybody. It was really an attempt to lock in their system of minority control for good. The key word here is unilateral. It just means they did it all by themselves, without anyone else's agreement. Britain, the old colonial power, didn't approve. The United Nations didn't approve. Basically, Rhodesia was going it alone, and it was a very lonely path. And the world's reaction was fast, and it was a big, fat no. The world essentially just turned its back on them. Not a single country officially recognized Rhodesia's independence. The UK condemned it. The UN imposed sanctions. And just like that, the country became a global outcast overnight. So you might think this declaration secured their future, but it did the opposite. It plunged the country into a long, difficult period of conflict, both from the outside world and from right there within its own borders. The main tool the world used against them was something called economic sanctions. So basically, other countries just refused to do business with Rhodesia. They stopped buying its major exports like tobacco and chrome, hoping that if they squeezed the economy hard enough, it would force the government to change. At the same time, resistance was building up inside Rhodesia. You had African nationalist groups, the biggest ones being ZANU and ZAPU, getting organized to demand equal rights. Their main demand was simple and powerful: one person, one vote. But when their peaceful protests were shut down, they felt they had no choice but to turn to armed struggle. And this led to a long, bitter conflict known as the Rhodesian Bush War. On one side, you had the government's security forces with all their modern technology and air power. On the other side were the nationalist guerrilla fighters, who used their knowledge of the land, launching hit-and-run attacks from the countryside. It was a brutal war that would drag on for years and cost tens of thousands of lives. After years and years of fighting, it started to become pretty clear that neither side could really win a total victory. The war was just draining the country of its resources and its hope, and it was pushing everyone, finally, toward the negotiating table. The big breakthrough came in London. A huge peace conference was held at a place called Lancaster House, and this was it. This was the moment where all the key players, the Rhodesian government, the nationalist leaders, all sat down in the same room to try and hammer out an end to the war. The result of all that talking was the Lancaster House Agreement of 1979. It laid out a really clear four-step plan for peace. First, a ceasefire, stop the fighting.
Second, write a new constitution that guarantees rights for everyone. Third, a short, temporary return to British control, just to oversee everything. And finally, the big one, the promise of free and fair elections for all citizens.
So there it was. This agreement was the blueprint for a whole new nation. The years of conflict were finally ending, and the stage was set for the birth of a new country, with a new name. And in 1980, that promise became a reality. For the very first time in the country's history, a fully democratic election was held where every single adult had an equal vote. For millions, it was this incredibly powerful emotional moment. You had people lining up for hours just to finally make their voices heard. So the election results came in, and Robert Mugabe's ZANU party won by a landslide. Then, on April 18, 1980, the old Rhodesian flag was lowered for the very last time, a new flag was raised, and the country was officially reborn as the independent nation of Zimbabwe. But look, the story doesn't just stop with independence. I mean, creating a flag and a new name is one thing, but building a unified nation? That's a whole other challenge. In those first few years, there was a real focus on reconciliation and just rebuilding. The new government invested a ton in education and healthcare, building thousands of new schools and clinics to serve everybody for the first time. They also started the super difficult but necessary process of merging the old rival armies into one single national force. But huge challenges were still there, and one of the biggest was land. Remember, under colonial rule, all the best farmland was controlled by that small white minority. The whole process of redistributing that land back to the majority black population was incredibly complicated and controversial, and it sparked debates that would shape the country for decades. And that really leaves us with a final, powerful question to think about. The journey from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe shows us that ending a war is really just a beginning. The real, ongoing work is this. After all the fighting stops, how do you actually build one nation out of people who were once enemies? It's a challenge that, honestly, countries all over the world are still trying to figure out today.